At the age of 15, he had already learned silence from A Child's History of Muad'Dib by the Princess Rulon. As Paul fought the Thopter's controls, he grew aware that he was throwing out the error-woven storm forces. His more than mentat awareness computing on the basis of fractional minutiae. He felt dust fronts, billowings, mixings of turbulence, an occasional vortex. The cabin interior was an angry box lighted by the green radiance of the instrument dials. The tan flow of dust outside appeared featureless, but his inner sense began to see through the curtain. I must find the right vortex, he thought. For a long time now, he had sensed the storm's power diminishing, but it still shook them. He waited out another turbulence. The vortex began as an abrupt billowing that rattled the entire ship. Paul defied all fear to bank the Thopter left. Jessica saw the maneuver on the altitude globe. "Paul!" she screamed. The vortex turned them, twisting, tipping. It lifted the Thopter like a chip on a geyser, speed them up and out, a winged speck within a core of winding dust lighted by the second moon. Paul looked down, saw the dust-defined pillar of hot wind that had disgorged them, saw the dying storm trailing away like a dry river into the desert, moon-gray motion growing smaller and smaller below as they rode the updraft. "We're out of it," Jessica whispered. Paul turned their craft away from the dust in swooping rhythm while he scanned the night sky. "We've given them the slip," he said. Jessica felt her heart pounding. She forced herself to calmness, looked at the diminishing storm. Her time sense said they had ridden within that compounding of elemental forces almost 4 hours, but part of her mind computed the passage as a lifetime. She felt reborn. It was like the litany, she thought. We faced it and did not resist. The storm passed through us and around us. It's gone, but we remain. I don't like the sound of our wing motion, Paul said. We suffered some damage in there. He felt the graying injured flight through his hands on the controls. They were out of the storm, but still not onto the full view of his prescient vision. Yet they had escaped, and Paul sensed himself trembling on the verge of a revelation. He shivered. The sensation was magnetic and terrifying, and he found himself caught on the question of what caused this trembling awareness. Part of it, he felt, was the spice-saturated diet of Arrakis. But he thought part of it could be the litany, as though the words had power of their own. I shall not fear. cause and effect. He was alive despite malignant forces, and he felt himself poised on the brink of self-awareness that he could not have been without the litany's magic. Words from the Orange Catholic Bible rang through his memory. What senses do we lack that we cannot see or hear another world all around us? There's rock all around, Jisk said. Paul focused on the Thopters launching, shook his head to clear it. He looked where his mother pointed, saw uplifting rock shapes black on the sand ahead and to the right. He felt wind around his ankles, a stirring of dust in the cabin. There was a hole somewhere. More of the storm's doing. Better set us down on the sand, Jisk said. The wings might not take full break. He nodded toward a place ahead where sand-blasted ridges lifted into the moonlight above the dunes. I'll set us down near those rocks. Check your safety harness. She obeyed, thinking, we've are in still suits. If we can find food, we can survive a long time on this desert. Fremen live here. What they can do, we can do. Run for those rocks the instant we're stopped, Paul said. I'll take the pack. Run for... She fell silent, nodded. Worms. Our friends, the worms, he corrected her. They'll get this Thopter. There'll be no evidence of where we landed. How direct is thinking, she thought. They glided lower. There came a rushing sense of motion to their passage. Blurred shadows of dunes, rocks lifting like islands. The Thopter touched a dune top with a soft lurch, skipped a sand valley, touched another dune. He's killing our speed against the sand, Jessica thought, and permitted herself to admire his competence. Brace yourself, Paul warned. He pulled back on the wing brakes, gently at first, then harder and harder. He felt them cup the air, their aspect ratio dropping faster and faster. Wind screamed through the lapped over and primaries of the wing's leaves. Abruptly, with only the faintest lurch of warning, the left wing, weakened by the storm, twisted upward and in, slamming across the side of the Thopter. The craft skidded across a dune top, twisting to the left. It tumbled down the opposite face to bury its nose in the next dune amid a cascade of sand. They stopped on the broken wing side, the right wing pointing toward the stars. Paul jerked off his safety harness, hurled himself upward across his mother, wrenching the door open. Sand poured around them into the cabin, bringing a dry smell of burned flint. He grabbed the pack from the rear, saw that his mother was free of her harness. She stepped up onto the side of the right-hand seat and out onto the Thopter's metal skin. Paul followed, dragging the pack by its straps. "Run!" he ordered. He pointed up the dune face and beyond it, where they could see a rock tower undercut by sandblast winds. Jessica leaped off the Thopter and ran, scrambling and sliding up the dune. She heard Paul's panting progress behind. They came out onto a sand ridge that curved away toward the rocks. "Follow the ridge," Paul ordered. "It'll be faster." They slogged toward the rocks, sand gripping their feet. A new sound began to impress itself upon them. A muted whisper, a hissing, an abrasive slithering. "Worm," Paul said. It grew louder. "Faster!" Paul gasped. The first rock shingle, like a beach slanting from the sand, lay no more than 10 meters ahead when they heard metal crunch and shatter behind them. Paul shifted his pack to his right arm, holding it by the straps. It slapped his eye as he ran. He took his mother's arm with his other hand. They scrambled onto the lifting rock, up a pebble-littered surface, through a twisted, wind-carved channel. Breath came dry and gasping in their throats. "I can't run any further," Jessica panted. Paul stopped, pressing her into a gut of rock, turned and looked down onto the desert. A mound in motion ran parallel to the rock island. Moonlit ripples, sand waves, a crusting burrow almost level with Paul's eyes at a distance of about a kilometer. The flattened dunes of its track curved once, a short loop crossing the patch of desert where they had abandoned their wrecked ornithopter. Where the worm had been, there was no sign of the aircraft. The burrow around moved outward into the desert, coursed back across its own path, questing. "It's bigger than a guild ship," Paul whispered. "I was told worms grew large in the deep desert, but I didn't realize how big." "Nor I," Jessica breathed. Again, the thing turned out away from the rocks, sped now with a curving track toward the horizon. They listened until the sound of its passage was lost in gentle sand stirrings around them. Paul took a deep breath, looked up at the moon-frosted escarpment, and quoted from the Kitab al-Labar. "Travel by night and rest in black shade through the day." He looked at his mother. "We still have a few hours of night. Can you go on?" "In a moment." Paul stepped out onto the rock shingle, shouldered the pack, and adjusted its straps. He stood a moment with a pair of compass in his hands. "Whenever you're ready," he said. She pushed herself away from the rock, feeling her strength return. Which direction? Where this ridge leads. He pointed. Deep into the desert, she said. The Fremen Desert, Paul whispered. And he paused, shaken by the remembered high-relief imagery of a prescient vision he had experienced on Caladan. He had seen this desert, but the set of the vision had been subtly different, like an optical image that had disappeared into his consciousness, been absorbed by memory, and now failed of perfect registry when projected onto the real scene. The vision appeared to have shifted and approached him from a different angle while he remained motionless. Idaho was with us in the vision, he remembered, but now Idaho is dead. Do you see a way to go? Jessica asked, mistaking her as hesitation. No, he said, but we'll go anyway. He settled his shoulders more firmly in the pack. Struck out up a sand-curbed channel in the rock. The channel opened onto a moonlit floor of rock with benched ledges climbing away to the south. Paul headed for the first ledge, clambered onto it. Jessica followed. She noted presently how their passage became a matter of immediate and particular. The sand pockets between rocks where their steps were slowed. The wind-carved ridge that cut their hands. The obstruction that forced the choice. Go over or go around. The terrain enforced its own rhythms. They spoke only when necessary, and then with the hoarse voices of their exertion. Careful here. This ledge is slippery with sand. Watch you don't hit your head against this overhang. Stay below this ridge. The moon's at our backs, and it'd show our movement to anyone out there. Paul stopped in a bight of rock, leaned the pack against the narrow ledge. Jessica leaned beside him, thankful for the moment of rest. She heard Paul pulling at his still tube, sipped her own reclaimed water. It tasted brackish, and she remembered the waters of Caladan, a tall fountain enclosing a curved curve of sky, such a richness of moisture that it had been noticed for itself, only for its shape, or its reflection, or its sound as she stopped beside it. To stop, she thought, to rest, truly rest. It occurred to her that mercy was the ability to stop, if only for a moment. There was no mercy where there could be no stopping. Paul pushed away from the rock ledge, turned, and climbed over a sloping surface. Jessica followed with a sigh. They slid down onto a wide shelf that left around the sheer rock face. Again, they fell into the destroyed rhythm of movement across this broken land. Jessica felt that the night was dominated by degrees of smallness in substances beneath their feet and hands. Boulders or pea gravel or flaked rock or pea sand or sand itself or grit or dust or gossamer powder. The powder clogged the nose filters and had to be blown out. Pea sand and pea gravel rolled on a hard surface and could spill the unwary. Rock flakes cut, and the omnipresent sand patches dragged against their feet. Paul stopped abruptly on a rock shelf, studied his mother as she stumbled into him. Stayed his mother as she stumbled into him. He was pointing left, and she looked along his arm to see that they stood atop a cliff with the desert stretched out like a stacked ocean some 200 meters below. It lay there full of moon-silvered waves. Shadows of angles that lapsed into curves, and in the distance lifted to the misted gray blur of another escarpment. Open desert, she said. A wide place to cross, Paul said, and his voice was muffled by the filter trap across his face. Jessica glanced left and right. Nothing but sand below. Paul stared straight ahead across the open dunes, watching the movement of shadows in the moon's passage. About 3 or 4 kilometers across, he said. Worms, she said, sure to be. She focused on her awareness. Muscle ache that dulled her senses. Shall we rest and eat? Paul slipped out of the pack, sat down, and leaned against it. Jessica supported herself by hand on his shoulder as she sank to the rock beside him. She felt Paul turn and as she settled herself. Heard him scrambling in the pack. Here, he said. His hand felt dry against hers as he pressed 2 energy capsules into her palm. She swallowed them with a grudging spit of water from her stillsuit tube. Drink all your water, Paul said. Axiom. The best place to conserve your water is in your body. It keeps your energy up. You're stronger, Trust your still suit. She obeyed, drained her cash pockets, feeling energy return. She thought then how peaceful it was here in this moment of their tiredness. And she recalled once hearing the minstrel warrior Granny Halleck say, bear a dry morsel and quietness than therewith than a house full of sacrifice and strife. Jessica repeated the words to Paul. That was Gurney, he said. She caught the tone of his voice, the way he spoke, as of someone dead. Thought, and well, poor Gurney might be dead. The Atreides forces were either dead or captive or lost like themselves in this wireless void. Gurney always had the right quotation, Paul said. I can hear him now. Now make the rivers dry and sell the land into the hand of the wicked. And I will make the land waste and all that is therein by the hand of strangers. Jessica closed her eyes and found herself moved close to tears by the passage, by the pathos in her son's voice. Presently, Paul said, how do you feel? She recognized that his question was directed at her pregnancy. Said, your sister won't be born for many months yet. I still feel physically adequate. And she thought, how stiffly formal I speak to my own son. Then, because it was the Bene Gesserit way to seek within for the answer to such an oddity, she searched and found the source of her formality. I'm afraid of my son. I fear his strangeness. I fear what he may see ahead of us, what he may tell me. Paul pulled his hood down over his eyes, listened to the bug-hustling sounds of the night. His lungs were charged with his own sounds. His nose itched. He rubbed it, removed the filter, and grew conscious of the rich smell of cinnamon. There's a lot of spice nearby, he said. An aider wind feathered Paul's cheeks, ruffled the folds of his burnous. But this one carried no threat of storm. Already he could sense the difference. Dawn soon, he said. Jessica nodded. There's a way to get safely across the open sand, Paul said. The Fremen do it. The worms? If we were to plant a thumper from our Frem kit back in the rocks here, Paul said, it'd keep a worm occupied for a time. She glanced at the stretch of moonlighted desert between them. And the other escarpment. 4 kilometers worth of time. Perhaps. And if we cross there, making only natural sounds, the kind that don't attract the worms. Paul studied the open desert, questing it in his prescient memory, probing the mysterious allusions to thumpers and maker hooks in the Fremkit manual that had come with their escape pack. He found it odd that all he sensed was pervasive terror at thought of the worms. He knew as though it lay just at the edge of his awareness that the worms were to be respected and not feared. If he shook his head, it'd have to be sounds without rhythm. Jessica said. What? Oh, yes. If we broke our steps. The sand itself must shift down at times. Worms can investigate every little sound. We should be fully rested before we try it, though. He looked out across that other rock wall, seeing the passage of time in the vertical moon shadows there. It'll be dawn within the hour. Where will we spend the day? He asked. Paul turned left, pointed. The cliff curves back north over there. You can see by the way it's wind cut. That's the windward face. There will be crevices there, deep ones. Have we better get started? She asked. He stood, helped her to her feet. Are you rested enough for a climb down? I want to get as close as possible to the desert floor before we camp. Enough. She nodded for him to lead the way. He hesitated, then lifted the pack, settled it onto his shoulders, and turned along the cliff. If only we had suspensors, Jessica thought. It'd be a much simple matter. It'd be such a simple matter to jump down there. But perhaps suspensors are another thing to avoid in the open desert. Maybe they attract the worms the way a shield does. They came to a series of shelves dropping down, and beyond them saw a fissure with its ledge outlined by moonshadow leaning along the vestibule. Paul led the way down, moving cautiously but hurrying because it was obvious the moonlight could not last much longer. They wound down into a world of deeper and deeper shadows, hints of rock shape climbed to the stars around them. The fissure narrowed to some 10 meters width at the brink of a dim gray sand slope that slanted downward into darkness. Can we go down? Jessica whispered. I think so. He tested the surface with one foot. We can slide down, he said. I'll go first. Wait until you hear me stop. Careful, she said. He stepped onto the slope and slid and slipped down its soft surface onto an almost level floor of packed sand. The place was deep within the rock walls. There came the sound of sand sliding behind him. He tried to see up the slope in the darkness, was almost knocked over by the cascade. It trailed away to silence. "Mother?" he said. There was no answer. "Mother!" He dropped the pack, hurled himself up the slope, scrambling, digging, throwing sand like a wild man. "Mother!" he gasped. "Mother, where are you?" Another cascade of sand swept down on him, burying him into the hips. He wrenched himself out of it. "She's been caught in the landslide," he thought. "Buried in it. I must be calm and work this out carefully. She won't smother immediately. She'll compose herself in Bindu suspension to reduce her oxygen needs. She knows I'll dig for her." In the Bene Gesserit way she had taught him, Paul stilled the savage beating of his heart, set his mind as a blank slate upon which the past few moments could write themselves. Every partial shift and twist of the slide replied itself in his memory, moving with an interior stateliness that contrasted with the fractional second of real time required for the total recall. Presently, Paul moved slantwise up the slope, probing cautiously until he found the wall of the fissure, an outcurve of rock there. He began to dig, moving the sand with care not to dislodge another slide. A piece of fabric came under his hands. He followed it, found an arm. Gently, he traced the arm, exposed her face. "Do you hear me?" he whispered. No answer. He dug faster, freed her shoulders. She was limp beneath his hands, but he detected a slow heartbeat. Hindu suspension, he told himself. He cleared the sand away to her waist, draped her arms over his shoulders, and pulled downslope slowly at first, then dragging her as fast as he could, feeling the sand give way above. Faster and faster he pulled, gasping with the effort, fighting to keep his balance. He was out on the hard-packed floor of the fissure then, swaying her with his shoulder and breaking into a staggering run as the entire slope came down with a loud hiss that echoed and was magnified within the rock walls. He stopped at the end of the fissure, where it looked out on the desert's marching dunes some 30 meters below. Gently, he lowered her to the sand, uttered the word to bring her to the catalepsis. She awakened slowly, taking deeper and deeper breaths. "I knew you'd find me," she whispered. He looked back up the fissure. "It might have been kinder if I didn't." "Paul, I lost the pack," he said. "It's buried under hundreds and tons of sand. At least." "Everything?" "The spare wire, the still tent, everything that counts." He touched a pocket. "I still have the air compass." He fumbled at the waist sash. "Knife and binoculars. We can get a good look around the place where we'll die." In that instant, the sun lifted above the horizon somewhere to the left beyond on the end of the fissure. Colors blinked in the sand out in the open desert. A chorus of birds held forth their songs from hidden places among the rocks, but Jessica had eyes only for the despair in Paul's face. She edged her voice with scorn, said, "Is this the way you were taught? Don't you understand?" He asked. "Everything we need to survive in this place is under that sand. You found me," she said, and now her voice was soft, reasonable. Paul squatted back on his heels. Presently he looked up the fissure at the new slope, studying it, marking the looseness of the sand. If we could immobilize a small area of that slope and the upper face of a hole dug into the sand, we might be able to put down a shaft to the pack. Water might do it, but we don't have enough water for... He broke off, then foam. Jessica held herself to stillness, lest she disturb the hyper-functioning of his mind. Paul looked at the open dunes, searching with his nostrils as well as his eyes, finding direction, and then centering his attention on a darkened patch of sand below them. "Spice," he said. "Its essence. Highly alkaline. And I have the paracompass. Its power pack is acid base." Jessica sat up straight against the rock. Paul ignored her, leaped to his feet, and was off down the uncompacted surface that spilled from the end of the fissure to the desert's floor. She watched the way he walked, breaking his stride. Step, pause, step, slide, pause. There was no rhythm to it that might tell a marauding worm something. Now the desert moved here. Paul reached the spice patch, shoveled a mound of it into a fold of his robe, returned to the fissure. He spilled the spice onto the sand in front of Jessica, squatted, and began dismantling the air compass using the point of his knife. The compass face came off. He removed his sash, spread the compass parts on it, lifted out the power pack. The dial mechanism came out next, leaving an empty dish compartment in the instrument. "You'll need water," Jessica said. Paul took the catch tube from his neck, sucked up a mouthful, expelled it into the dish compartment. If this fails, that's water wasted, Jessica thought. But it won't matter then anyway. With his knife, Paul cut open the power pack, spilled its crystals into the water. They foamed slightly, subsided. Jessica's eyes caught the motion above them. She looked up to see a line of hawks along the rim of the fissure. They perched there, staring down at the open water. Great mother, she thought. They can sense water even at that distance. Paul had the cover back on the paracompass, leaving off the reset button, which gave a small hole into the liquid. Taking the reworked instrument in one hand, a handful of spice in the other, all went back up the fissure, studying the lay of the slope. His robe billowed gently without the sash to hold it. He waded part way up the slope, caking off the sand rivulets, spurts of dust. Presently he stopped, pressed a pinch of the spice into the paracompass, shook the instrument case. Green foam boiled out of the hole where the reset button had been. Paul aimed it at the slope, spread a low dike there, began kicking away the sand beneath it, immobilizing the opened face with more foam. Jessica moved to a position below him, called all out, "May I help?" "Come up and dig," he said. "We have about 3 meters to go." "It's going to be near a thing." As he spoke, the foam stopped billowing from the instrument. "Quickly," Paul said. "No telling how long this foam will hold the sand." Jessica scrambled up beside Paul as he lifted another inch of spice into the hole, shook the paracompass case. Again, foam boiled from it. As Paul directed the foam barrier, Jessica dug with her hands, hurling the sand down the slope. "How deep?" she panted. "About 3 meters, he said. "And I can only approximate the position. We may have to widen this hole." He moved a step aside, slipping in the loose sand. "Slant your digging backward. Don't go straight down." Jessica obeyed. Slowly the hole went down, reaching a level even with the floor of the basin, and still no sign of the pack. Could I have miscalculated? Paul asked himself. I'm the one that panicked originally and caused this mistake. Has that warped my ability? He looked at the paracompass. Less than 2 ounces of the acid infusion remained. Jessica straightened in the hole, rubbed the foam-stained hand across her cheek. Her eyes met Paul's. The upper face, Paul said, gently now. Added another pinch of spice to the container. Sent the foam boiling around Jessica's hands as she began cutting a vertical face in the upper slant of the hole. On the second pass, her hands encountered something hard. Slowly, she worked out a length of strap with a plastic buckle. Don't move any more of it, Paul said. And his voice was almost a whisper. We're out of foam. Jessica held the strap in one hand, looked up at him. Paul threw the empty paracompass down onto the floor of the basin. Said, give me your other hand. Now listen carefully. I'm going to pull you to the side and downhill. Don't let go of that strap. We won't get much more spill from the top. The slope has stabilized itself. All I'm going to aim for is to keep your head free of sand. Once that hole's filled, we can dig you out and pull up the pack. I understand, she said. Ready? Ready. She tensed her fingers on the strap. With one surge, Paul held her half out of the hole, holding her head up as the foam barrier gave way and sand spilled down. When it had subsided, Jessica remained buried into the waist. Her left arm and shoulder still under the sand. Her chin protected on a fold of Paul's robe. Her shoulder ached from the strain put on it. I still have the strap, she said. Slowly, Paul worked his hand into the sand beside her. Found the strap. Together, he said. Steady pressure. We mustn't break it. More sand spilled down as they worked the pack up. When the strap cleared the surface, Paul stopped, freed his mother from the sand. Together, then, they pulled the pack downslope and out of its trap. In a few minutes, they stood on the floor of the fissure, holding the pack between them. Paul looked at his mother. Foam stained her face, her robe. Sand was caked to her where the foam had dried. She looked as though she had been a target for balls of wet green sand. You look a mess, he said. You're not so pretty yourself, she said. They started to laugh and sobered. That shouldn't have happened, Paul said. I was careless. She shrugged, feeling caked sand fall away from her robe. I'll put up the tent, he said. Better slip off that robe and shake it out. He turned away, taking the pack. Jessica nodded, suddenly too tired to answer. There's anchor holes in this in the rock. Paul said, "Someone's been here before. Why not?" she thought, as she brushed her robe. This was a likely place deep in rock walls and facing another cliff some 4 kilometers away, far enough above the desert to avoid worms, but close enough for easy access before or a crossing. She turned, seeing that Paul had the tent up, its ribbed on hemisphere blending with the rock walls of the fissure. Paul stepped past her, lifting his binoculars. He adjusted their internal pressure with a quick twist, focused the oil lenses on the other cliff, lifting golden and morning light across the open sand. Jessica watched as he studied that apocalyptic landscape, his eyes probing into sand rivers and canyons. "There are growing things over there," he said. Jessica found the spare binoculars in the back beside the tent, moved up beside Paul. "There." he said, holding the binoculars with one hand and pointing with the other. She looked where he pointed. "Saguaro," she said. "Scrawny stuff. There may be people nearby," Paul said. "That could be the remains of a botanical testing station," she warned. "It is pretty far off into the desert," he said. He lowered his binoculars, rubbed beneath his filter baffle, feeling how dry and chapped his lips were, sensing the dusty taste of thirst in his mouth. "This has the feeling of a Fremen place," he said. "Are we certain the Fremen will be friendly?" she asked. "Kinds promised their help. But there's desperation in the people of this desert," she thought. "I felt some of it myself today. Desperate people might kill us for our water." She closed her eyes again, and against this wasteland conjured in her mind a scene from Kaladin. There had been a vacation trip once on Kaladin. She and the Duke Leto, before Paul's birth, they'd flown over the southern jungles, above the weed-walled shining leaves and rice paddies of the deltas. And they had seen antlions in the greenery, men gangs carrying their loads on Spencer Boyd shoulder poles. And the sea reaches there had been the white pels of Amaran to house. All of it gone. Jessica opened her eyes to the desert stillness, to the mounting warmth of day. Restless heat devils were beginning to set the air quiver out on the open sand. The other rock face across from them was like a thing seen through cheap glass. A spill of sand spread its brief curtain across the open end of the fissure. The sand hissed down, loosed by puffs of morning breeze, by the hawks that were beginning to lift away from the cliff top. Where the sandfall was gone, she still heard it hissing. It grew louder. A sound that once heard was never forgotten. Worms, Paul whispered. It came from their right, with an unerring majesty that could not be ignored. A twisting burrow mound of sand cut through the dunes within their field of vision. The mound lifted in front, dusting away like a bow wave in water. Then it was gone, coursing to the left. The sound diminished, died. I've seen spice frigates that were smaller, Paul whispered. She nodded, continuing to stare across the desert. Where the worm had passed, there remained that tantalizing gap. It flowed barely endless before them, beckoning beneath its horizontal collapse of skyline. When we rested, Jessica said, we should continue with your lessons. He suppressed a sudden anger, said, Mother, don't you think we could do without today? You panicked. Jessica said, you know your mind and been to overture perhaps better than I do. But you've much yet to learn about your body's musculature. The body does things of itself sometimes, all. And I can teach you about this. You must learn to control every muscle, every fiber of your body. You need review of the hands. We'll start with finger muscles, palm tendons, and tip sensitivity. She turned away. Come into the tent now. He flexed the fingers of his left hand, watching her crawl through the sphincter valve, knowing that he could not deflect her from this determination that he must agree. Whatever has been done to me, I've been a party to it, he thought. Review of the hand. He looked at his hand, how inadequate it appeared when measured against such creatures as that worm.